My friends, let's get started. I am so thrilled that you're here. It is such a great turnout and a wonderful piece of feedback to those of us who've been in the planning of this, that we are all cognizant of how important it is for us to create a new economic justice system. So thanks for being here and for being on the road with us. I want to bring to your attention and simply remind you that we will reconvene tonight at 7? 6:30. Like I said, we'll reconvene at 6:30 tonight. And we will have two speakers. Richard will get us started, break us open, inspire us. And then Helene will we'll be with him and take it home. And then we'll be back tomorrow night at 6:30? Like I said, 7 tomorrow night. 6:30 tonight and 7 tomorrow night. Please don't miss this. Please don't be ignorant. Please, like I am, please get equipped, okay? Now, we also have ways for you to take this home in a more personal way. We have small groups. We have 12 planned, meeting once a week for 3 weeks, beginning next Sunday night, Sunday through Thursday, from November 3 to November 21. That will be a focus of economic justice for this year. Then we are going to hit it again in January, hopefully with a one book, one parish kind of thing. But we need to be together on the frontier of helping our country do something different about economics, okay? So, thanks for being here. Please understand that we have an action table always at All Saints. Today we want you to take action on economics and making sure that Congress passes a budget that adequately funds programs addressing hunger and helping people move out of poverty. Action table is a central part of our life here at All Saints Church. We want to welcome those of you who are visiting with us. We have welcome bags available to you. They contain brochures about upcoming speakers and conferences and workshops. And if you have yet to pledge and would like to, we depend on your contributions so that we can afford these and other very inspiring programs. But let's get to it. Richard Parker is the lecturer in public policy and senior fellow of the Shorenstein Center and at Harvard Kennedy School, the School of Government. Oxford-trained economist. His career before coming to the Kennedy School in '93 included journalism. He co-founded the magazine that we all love, Mother Jones, as well as an investigative reporter and editor, and he chairs the editorial board of another magazine we all love, The Nation. Philanthropy was another part of his life as the executive director of 2 foundations. He donated more than $40 million to social change groups. He's been involved in social entrepreneurship. He grew the environmental group Greenpeace from 2,000 to 600,000 supporters and helped launch the wonderful organization People for the American Way and raised over $250 million for some 60 nonprofits. He's been involved in political consulting, advising, among others, Senators Kennedy, Glenn, Cranston, and McGovern. And from 2009 to 2011, he was an economic advisor to Greek Prime Minister George Papandreou. He has a string of articles and books he has published. They have appeared everywhere, but before he speaks, I simply want to tell you that he's a friend of this parish. He grew up as a priest's son in this diocese, and his dad and George Regas were very, very close friends. He has been in the force field of All Saints for a long time. We had him speak at the vestry conference 2 years ago. He absolutely blew our socks off, and I'm thrilled to present to you Professor Richard Parker.
I'm a preacher's kid, so I'm going to do something that preacher kids do, which is I'm going to start with a prayer, and then I'm going to tell a joke, okay? The prayer is by Reinhold Niebuhr. Nothing that is worth doing can be achieved in our lifetime. Therefore, we must be saved by hope. Nothing which is true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history. Therefore, we must be saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. Therefore, we must be saved by love. Amen. Amen. If I could thank them, I would come with my 13 years of perfect attendance pins draping down one side of my body. I'm a survivor of the Episcopal Church. My father was the rector.
We're streaming to thousands.
All right. My father was the rector of St. Cross in Hermosa Beach for 42 years and began his life as an Episcopalian in Los Angeles here at All Saints in 1927. He was here because he was a boy who grew up in Pittsburgh, where his father was a businessman. In the summer of 1927, his aunt and uncle, who had a cattle ranch out toward Riverside, came east on the train to buy a car, which they decided would be a large Packard touring car, and that they would drive the car all the way back to California. My father thought, this sounds interesting, and he hitched a ride with his aunt and uncle. It took them 3.5 weeks to drive from Pittsburgh to Los Angeles. They got across parts of the Mojave Desert, according to him, in places on slatted boards because they'd not figured out how to stabilize asphalt in the mid-1920s yet. And he came here to All Saints the first Sunday that he arrived in Southern California. He attended regularly for the next 5 years while he went through Pasadena City College and then USC. I know the UCLA people are like moaning already. And then went off to divinity school in New Haven. And that was the only 3-year period. That was the only time he then left Southern California until he died 22 years ago. So I am not just an Episcopalian of the Diocese of Los Angeles. I owe my existence in some real way to All Saints. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. What I want to do today is, well, let me tell the joke first. And you Episcopalians will know this joke immediately. Why do Episcopalians never go to orgies? Too many thank you notes the next morning. I told this to Baptists, and they just scratch their heads. They have no idea. And I can just think, cream-colored stock, double-lined envelope. Where's my fountain pen? I've got to do this right. What would Mom say? Oh, you also know how to spot a bride at an Episcopal wedding? She's the one kissing the golden retriever. It's not a big market for these jokes, so I can only tell them once every few years, but I enjoy the laughter back from folks like you. The Episcopal Church was very important to me growing up because I had no choice in the matter. I was an acolyte, I was a member of choir, I was a member of the YPF. In fact, I was head of YPF at St. Cross my senior year. I was a member of the church's scout troop. I was an Eagle Scout in the church's scout troop. I got my God and Country Award in the church's scout troop and my Order of the Arrow. And I went off to Dartmouth College in 1964 and didn't walk through a church front door for the next 15 years because I had done 30 years worth of church in the first 17 years of my life. But it's important to say why I came back, because I'm on a mission. And the mission is to reignite a passion for being Episcopalians, not just for being Christians, but to understand that we come from a specific part of the American Christian tradition, and it's something we need to know more about, be proud of, and recreate going forward in the 21st century. Let me tell you some of the components of that. Next month, we'll celebrate Thanksgiving, when the Puritans and the Pilgrims came to Massachusetts. But there was already an Anglican church operating in Jamestown, Virginia, 15 years before the Pilgrims landed. When you look back at the early history of the United States, we hear so much about the Congregationalists in Massachusetts, but the power of the Anglican Church, which then becomes the Episcopal Church, has sometimes gone too unremarked, and I think it's a mistake. Because if what you do is look back at the names of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, half of all the signers were Anglican/Episcopalian. Half. When you look at the signers of the United States Constitution, half of the signers of the United States Constitution were by then Episcopalians. When you look at the record of presidents of the United States who have served this country so well, from George Washington up to Barack Obama, 1 out of every 4 American presidents has been an Episcopalian. We represent roughly 1.5% of the American population nowadays. We've never been more at our best days than 3% of the population. But think about that. Half the signers of the Declaration, half the signers of the Constitution, 1/4 of all the presidents, 1/4 of all the congressmen, the senators and representatives who have served. It's an extraordinary achievement. And it's something we don't want to go around tooting about. It gets the Baptists crazy. But it's also something we mustn't forget because it's pointing us in a direction that is at the heart of what it means to be an Episcopalian. My father, like John Burt, like Ed Bacon, like George Regas, comes out of and lives that tradition. You're here worshiping in a church led by men and women who understand the heart of that tradition. But I want you to learn to be comfortable with that tradition, beyond the songs, beyond the readings of the Bible, beyond the architecture of the buildings, beyond the respect for both the aesthetic and the ethical, which I think are at the heart of what is best about being an Episcopalian. That you can love beauty, truth, and justice and feel no apology for living your life in celebration of all three. My mother once said of my father, and this explains my life with Mother Jones and the Nation and Greenpeace and everything else, that my father thought that the Holy Trinity was Father, Son, and Franklin Roosevelt. That didn't mean that my father was an ideological Democrat. And it was certainly the case that all 4 of my grandparents were Republicans, but Republicans of an earlier kind. Republicans who had voted for Wendell Willkie, had voted for Dwight Eisenhower, not for Michelle Bachmann, not for Eric Cantor, not for John Boehner. It was a different Republican Party, and it has an honorable tradition within it. And when my mother said that my father thought that the Holy Trinity was Father, Son, and Franklin Roosevelt, it wasn't because Roosevelt was a Democrat, but because he modeled what it meant to be an Episcopal lay person. My dad was always touched by the idea that President Roosevelt, even in the White House, remained senior warden of his little parish in Hyde Park and was notorious for stopping cabinet meetings to take a phone call from the rector because of some matter of business related to the little parish in Hyde Park. And what does that symbolize? It symbolizes living your life in the world, living your life in a position of extraordinary power and decision-making, and yet trying to stay on a daily, hourly basis connected to the foundations and the structure of your faith. We need more of that in the Episcopal Church. We need to help each other understand what it is to combine a sense of living in the world and being comfortable with the exercise of power. Because without power, you have to understand, all this talk of love in the Bible doesn't get us to justice. One of the greatest books that Paul Tillich ever wrote was literally entitled Love, Power, Justice. And the essence of Tillich's message half 60 years ago now, was that so often, particularly given his life growing up in 1920s Germany, then leaving Germany in the early days of the Nazi dictatorship, of working with Reinhold Niebuhr to save hundreds of thousands of Jews in Europe from anti-Semitism by pressing the case that America in the 1930s needed to learn how to talk about America being of a Judeo-Christian heritage, not simply a Christian heritage, of understanding that language counts, and of understanding also that it is absolutely essential to take on the challenges that power always represents. That which can mislead us into doing evil, that which will mislead us into doing evil, but that to not embrace it is an act of either theological misunderstanding of who we are or an act of cowardice for which we have no excuse. The issues facing the United States today are often said to be new. Oh, we're in a world of globalization and speeding communication. My God, the internet, look how you can get so much information so quickly from all over the world. There's a wonderful book I'd commend to you called The Victorian Internet, which is the history of the spread of the telegraph in the United States. You have to remember that it's the 19th century, not the 20th or the early 21st century, that saw the most dramatic compression of time and distance. Starting the 19th century, men and women were crossing oceans or going up and down rivers under sail power. Crossing the land, they were being hauled by horses, sometimes oxen, or they were walking. By the end of the 19th century, more and more they were traveling in trains that went 60 and 70 miles an hour, in steamships that could go 30 knots. And my God, there was something called the airplane that was about to begin the 20th century and revolutionize our life even more. So when you think about yourselves living in a new world for which there is no precedent, stop and say to yourself, baloney. Baloney. The compression of time and distance that leaves us so often so dislocated, so awash, so confused about where to go, and we use it as a story we tell ourselves about oftentimes why we can't do X, why we can't do Y. Stand back and imagine what that revolution was in the 19th century, and yet how people then transformed the world. How they transformed the world. You have to understand that in the 1860s, America launched itself on our own version of a religious war. You understand that, I'm sure. That the sin of slavery had become so enormous that the country could not go on half slave and half free. That it had been our original constitutional sin that in our desire to forge a single nation out of 13 colonies, we had put slavery into the Constitution. And what you have to remember in the years leading up to the Civil War was that much of the debate that went on across America wasn't a debate between lawyers or between scholars of universities, because there weren't extensive, large university systems. They were debates within congregations. And they were debates between clergy. And when you think about Uncle Tom's Cabin, the father of the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin was, of course, a minister. When you think about William Lloyd Garrison, you realize that Garrison's passion for abolition was driven by his Christian faith. My own ancestor, the Reverend Theodore Parker, one of the dark side of the family, Unitarian, but we've had a few slip-ups here and there. My father always said he loved Unitarians because they were the people who prayed to whom it may concern, and so he could always get a good word for Jesus Christ in there. with his good Unitarian friends. But Theodore Parker is one of those remarkable 19th century figures whom we remember today barely at all, but who contributed via other speakers two extraordinary phrases to the English language. One is government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Abraham Lincoln lifted that from Parker's sermons because Lincoln's law partner was a great admirer of Theodore Parker and came east to visit and brought back a copy of the sermons, which have been found by Lincoln scholars, where Lincoln has underlined the passage. A century later, another phrase you may know in relationship to civil rights is the arc of the universe bends toward justice. Martin Luther King took that from Theodore Parker. I do this not to toot as a sort of a son of the American Revolution, but rather to say to you how deeply our lives can go on echoing over decades and centuries if we take the mission that has been handed to us by Jesus Christ seriously. What is it that makes Episcopalians mainliners and not evangelicals? Because as you understand, American Protestantism, white American Protestantism, can pretty much be cleaved into two camps: mainliners and evangelicals, and we're very definitely in the mainline camp. The essence, I think, of what makes us mainliners is that we accept the idea that we can be baptized in Jesus Christ as children and come to understand his claim on us and his claim for us on the world as a matter of continuing progressive revelation that reveals itself in things like science, including Darwinism, including physics, including the social sciences. Whereas the evangelical tradition is deeply called to adult baptism and the idea of the embrace of Jesus Christ as your personal Savior. The real differences between those two traditions had become so large, as many of you know, that by the 1840s, the three largest Protestant denominations in the United States, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, and the Congregationalists, all broke apart as churches along north-south lines. They took seriously that they could be Christians along with fellow Christians and disagree with fellow Christians about the nature of this life on earth and not simply wait for the by and by to provide Jesus Christ's return, but rather in the interim while we're waiting that we get a damn sight bit of work done quickly that bends the arc of the universe toward justice. We need to understand that about ourselves. We need to understand where we come from. You can look now, for example, at lots of studies of income and education, and there are really some striking differences that you'll see between these two traditions. There was a wonderful study by the Pew people. If you don't know Pew, you should go online and look at Pew Religion Center, all the social science data that's now available that will just tell you so much about America. Well, if you rank denominations or blocks by household income, the top performing group in the United States today are Hindus. The second top performers are Jews. The third are Episcopalians. In terms of education, same thing. 1, 2, 3. We're the highest ranked in terms of graduate or post-high school education. We, in other words, have enjoyed advantages. Some would say privileges. I would say advantages. And that we believe, I believe, they're that the advantages that should be available to all, not just to a few. And that brings me to the issue of economics. The issue before the United States today is not a new issue. The issue is whether or not we will continue to grow together as a nation that provides comfort for the afflicted and afflicted who are too comfortable. That's our work. That is our work. That's what we are called upon to do. What's important to understand is that in the late 19th century, that was the work too. We talk about, whoa, the world's changing. Well, the world was changing in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s as millions of immigrants came rushing to the United States. Sound familiar? At a time when government was unable to control the growing inequality that was emerging from the new waves of technology and economic organization that were defining production capitalism in the years after the Civil War and before the First World War. And there were plenty of arguments that no, government was already too big. But let me say something about the federal government in the late 19th century. The largest block of employees in the federal government up until the 1920s was postal workers. The United States had more post office employees than it had soldiers or sailors throughout the 19th century. Most government work took place on the state and local level, not on the federal level. At the beginning of the 19th century, the federal government might have constituted 1 or 2 percentage points of GDP. All government together, federal, state, and local, couldn't have reached more than about 4 or 5% of GDP. By the beginning of the 20th century, 100 years ago, the sum of all three governments sectors in the United States was 9 percentage points of GDP. Today, it's much larger. But it's been large all my life. And it became large not simply because of the Depression and Franklin Roosevelt, because the interesting thing about government in the Depression was that as the federal government stepped up under Roosevelt's leadership to provide jobs, to provide food, to provide regulation of the stock market, to provide regulation of banking so that banks wouldn't collapse in the midst of crises like the ones they had in the 30s or that we've had in the last few years here. State and local government simultaneously got smaller. And so the net size of government at the end of the 1930s was not that dramatically large. What grew the American government was the Second World War. By 1944, the government of the United States was taking over half of all the economic output of the United States in order to defeat fascism. And then in the aftermath of the Second World War, as it became clear that we were going to be locked into a long and brutal struggle with the Soviet Union, the United States government didn't get smaller. It got bigger. And it got to a point where by the time that Dwight Eisenhower came into office, this is in the early 1953, 60 years ago, the sum of all government spending in the United States was on the order of about 30 to 33% of GDP, about a third. And it's been pretty much, and this will shock you, it's been pretty much that since Dwight Eisenhower was president. We haven't gone through some extraordinary explosion of government. Share of government GDP has been sort of cycling around in the low, middle 30%, 35%. Right now it's up higher because of the massive deficits that were called out by this enormous financial market collapse that we had on Wall Street, and then the compensatory federal spending that had to be done to keep us from actually reinventing the Great Depression. Because we were almost there, you understand that. That if it hadn't been for that Episcopalian Franklin Roosevelt and what he had left the country, the insurance of the bank deposits, unemployment insurance, more recently the creation of food stamps, all of the kinds of social safety nets, both of individuals and of the financial sector, we would be up the proverbial creek without a paddle. And we're looking at that happening again, because I will tell you as an economist, for all of the talk and all of the legislation done since Lehman melted down, we have not solved the fundamental problems of the American economy. We have not solved them. What we have done is create a politics in which one side vociferously calls for something they describe as small or limited government, but without ever actually telling you, all right, what would the percentage of GDP look like under your plan? Well, like Reagan's. Well, I'm sorry, under Ronald Reagan, the federal government became the largest it has since World War II. Hello? Oh, well, it's about balanced budgets. Who was the last Republican president to balance a federal budget? Dwight David Eisenhower. Dwight David Eisenhower in 1957 was the last elected Republican president to balance a federal budget. Where I come from, that's not a track record that encourages you to think that people know what the hell they're talking about, or that they're doing a lot of talking and that's not what they're doing. And when people like us don't educate ourselves, don't share what we've learned, don't sharpen our ability to say what it is that would look like a balanced world going forward in the 21st century, we put at risk all of our lives. You've seen those charts that show the declining economic income and wealth inequality of the United States running continuously from the Second World War right down to the early 1970s. And then like a V, you know exactly which way inequality in income and wealth have been going ever since the early 1970s. Back up. In just shares of income shared, controlled by different cohorts or different groups in the United States, we're as inegalitarian today as we were in the United States in 1925. We're as inegalitarian in terms of income and wealth distribution in the United States as at any point since we implemented the federal income tax, which gives us the data to figure out what's going on, and that was in 1912. So we've set something of an extraordinary record. In my lifetime, 66 years, we have gone from being very unequal to being the most egalitarian that we'd ever been in the early 1970s, and then we've let it slip through our fingers. And it wasn't because the benefits of letting income and wealth inequality grow that we got balanced budgets or smaller government. We've gotten the worst of all possible worlds. I'm not here to advocate for big government just for the sake of big government. I'm here as a very practical economist saying there are some things that are better done collectively than individually. And that I'm tired of being in a debate where somebody says, well, there's government and then there's the market economy, and I say 40% of the market economy is accounted for by government. Would you talk about a marriage only in terms of the husband in the marriage? I think that's mad. We have got to get past this crazy false dichotomy that there's the market on the one hand and government on the other. We have choices to make about the kinds of markets that we want, and we have choices to make about the kind and scope and duties of the government that we want, and we need to get on with drilling down to decide what those are going forward. What's more complicated, what is different from the late 19th century when an earlier generation of Episcopalians and other mainliners had to face these questions and were in the vanguard of creating the modern university system, of creating modern social science, of actually creating the fundamentals of a modern government system, including the Federal Reserve, the tax system, bureaucracies that are actually competent to do things like estimate whether or not the climate is getting warmer or not. Because you don't want to assign that kind of work to the oil companies. Or do you? Maybe, I don't think you do at All Saints. So the issue before us is one of grabbing hold with both hands of an economy that by any reasonable measure is working well for fewer and fewer Americans, and more Americans understand that, to judge from the polls. But it's not going to be solved by these arguments about limited government. It's not a question of limit, it's a question of what do you want it to do? And how will it be fairly paid for? And what will be its role in creating the opportunities for decent, remunerative employment so that when someone gets up and goes to work at the end of the year, she's earned enough to take care of her family. Because that isn't the case right now, and you know it. It just isn't the case right now. We have let something wonderful about our country slip through our fingers, and we're arguing about the wrong things. And it is up to Episcopalians, who I believe come out of a mainline tradition, who have for hundreds of years, a tiny church, produced men and women, not just clergy, but laity, who were able to see into the present and then into the future and help lead the United States somewhere better, not worse. The reason it's so complicated now, going into the 21st century, you all understand, because the economic system now outstrips any national government. The integration of firms across borders is now so extraordinary, so extensive, so complicated, that no single government setting policy for its own people within its own borders can do enough. We actually have to step up to find some way of working cooperatively to structure treaties, to create regulatory agencies, to move the 21st century in precisely the direction that Franklin Roosevelt was moving it when he backed the United Nations in the midst of the Second World War. You have to remember, this is not left-wing Democrat Franklin Roosevelt. This is Episcopalian Franklin Roosevelt. And remember, too, that his cousin, the Republican Roosevelt, was a progressive Episcopalian as well, too. It isn't a question of Republican or Democratic Party as such. It's a question of sane Democrats and sane Republicans versus insane Democrats and insane Republicans setting the agenda. And you people here are at the heart of how to win back the country for sanity. That's why it's such a pleasure to be here with you today. To look out and see these faces, to see that you can not only laugh at a joke about orgies and Episcopalians and brides kissing golden retrievers, but also understand something about what it is to be in a mainline Protestant tradition. To understand that it is not triumphalism to say our ancestors have accomplished a lot and much is now expected of us. It is duty. We have a duty to this country and to ourselves to bring politics closer to a rational, sane structure, and importantly, to move us ahead into an increasingly integrated global world where the United States will not lead alone and shouldn't. But the values that are the best of the United States must be spread. China is going to have a bigger economy than ours in GDP terms fairly shortly. India, by the end of the 21st century, will have a larger economy. Brazil very well could. All we need is one or two more layman-style moments because we didn't get it right in terms of re-regulating our finance system. And hell, Canada will be bigger. And that's not, guys, really. You know the definition of a liberal Episcopalian is someone who dated a Canadian in college. Right? I like Canadians, but we are not turning over the future of the world to our brothers and sisters to the north. We have work to do. But it requires a kind of courage that draws on who we are not just as Americans, but in a deeper sense who we are as Christians, as defined through our Episcopal faith. And so it is a pleasure to be here this morning. It is a pleasure to see Ed Bacon at the helm of this terrific, terrific church, and I thank you. Good.
So let's get this clear. Publicity, communication of everyone. This says 6 p.m. tonight. So tonight is from 6 to 8. What time do we come here tonight? 6. Thank you. And tomorrow night is 7, and the small group sign-up is at this table. And I hate the fact that we can't take questions. If you have questions, then obviously the Holy Spirit wants you to come back here tonight so that you can pose those questions. Now, one other thing, you can do something to move us into a sane, compassion-based, justice-oriented economy between now and 6 p.m. And that is call two friends and bring them so that they can get educated tonight, okay? Let's once again thank you, Richard Parker. We're adjourned.